The rain didn't just fall that Tuesday. It hammered against the pavement with a rhythmic, heavy thud that matched Arthur's mood. At 62, Arthur was a man of habit. He wore a coat that had seen better decades and carried an umbrella with a slightly bent handle. He wasn't a rich man, nor was he a particularly lucky one. He was simply a man who liked old things. He liked the smell of aging paper, the weight of solid brass, and the mystery of objects that had outlived their original owners. He stepped off the curb, dodging a puddle that reflected the neon sign of a nearby pharmacy, and ducked into a narrow alleyway. This was the shortcut to the dustbin, a shop that lived up to its name in every sense. It wasn't a boutique vintage store with curated displays and overpriced candles. It was a chaotic, overflowing warehouse of forgotten lives. As Arthur pushed the heavy wooden door, a bell chimed weakly, muffled by the sheer volume of stuff packed into the room. The air inside was thick with the scent of cedar, floor wax, and that specific dry smell of old fabric. "Late today, aren't you?" A voice rasped from behind a wall of stacked chairs. That was Elias. He had owned the shop for 40 years and looked like he might have been part of the original inventory. He was sitting in a corner, tinkering with a mechanical watch. A jeweler's loop pressed against his eye, as the weather had other plans. "Elias," Arthur replied, shaking his umbrella outside the door before stepping fully inside. "Anything new, or just the usual ghosts?" "Back corner," Elias grunted, gesturing with a pair of tweezers toward a dimly lit area where the ceiling leaked slightly into a plastic bucket. "Estate sale from up the coast? Mostly junk. Clothes, kitchenware, and a few crates of frames. Haven't even had the energy to price them yet." Arthur nodded and began his slow, methodical crawl through the aisles. This was his meditation. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for a connection. He passed a stack of chipped porcelain plates and a box of black and white photographs of people whose names had been lost to time. He always felt a pang of sadness looking at those photos' entire lives. The air was colder here, and the sound of the rain on the tin roof was deafening. He saw the crates Elias had mentioned. They were piled high with hotel art, those mass-produced. Paintings of flowers or sunsets that people buy to fill a void on a wall. He began to flip through them. Flip, flip, flip. A faded print of a hunting dog. A cracked mirror. A wooden frame with no glass. Then he stopped. Tucked between a broken TV tray and a stack of dusty encyclopedias was a small canvas, perhaps no larger than a standard piece of notebook paper. It was shoved into a heavy, dark wood frame that looked far too substantial for the artwork it held. The painting itself was grim. It depicted a coastline during a storm. The colors were muddy various shades of slate gray, bruised purple, and a murky, sickly green for the sea. It looked like the work of an amateur, someone who had tried to capture the violence of the ocean, but ended up with a blurry, dark mess yet. As Arthur pulled it out, felt a strange prickle at the base of his neck. He wiped a layer of greasy dust off the surface with his thumb. The paint was thick, much thicker than the cheap prints surrounding it. He tilted the canvas toward the single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Under the grime, he noticed something. The way the light hit the muddy waves wasn't accidental. There were tiny, microscopic flecks of white and pale yellow that caught the light, giving the water a sense of motion that felt ... uncomfortable. It felt real. "How much for the stormy one?" Arthur called out, his voice sounding slightly higher than usual. Elias didn't even look up from his watch. "The ugly little thing in the heavy frame?" "Give me $5 for the frame and you can take the canvas for free. It's depressing to look at." Arthur reached into his pocket. He had exactly $7. He pulled out a $5 bill, his fingers trembling just a fraction. He didn't know why. It was a terrible painting. It would probably just end up in his basement along with his other projects. "5 it is," Arthur said. He didn't stay to chat like he usually did. He wrapped the painting in a plastic grocery bag to protect it from the rain, tucked it under his coat, and stepped back out into the storm. As he walked home, The weight of the frame pressed against his ribs. He didn't feel like a man who had just spent $5 on junk. He felt like a man who was carrying a secret. When he reached his small apartment, he didn't even take off his wet coat. He went straight to the kitchen table, cleared away a stack of mail, and placed the painting face down on a clean towel. The back of the frame was sealed with old, brittle brown paper that had turned the color of tobacco. It was held in place by small, rusted nails. Arthur grabbed a pair of pliers from a drawer. He worked slowly, his breath hitching in his chest. One by one, he pulled the nails. He carefully lifted the wooden backing. He expected to see the rough, cream-colored back of the canvas instead. A small, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a drop of red wax that had long ago cracked into pieces, slid out from the gap between the frame and the painting. Arthur stared at it. His heart began to thud against his ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm that drowned out the sound of the rain. He hadn't even looked at the painting again yet. He reached for the envelope, his hands shaking violently now. He knew, with a sudden and terrifying certainty, that his life was about to split into two parts. Before this moment, and after, Arthur sat at his kitchen table for a long time, just staring at the small envelope. The rain continued to lash against his window, but the sound felt miles away now. The red wax seal, though cracked, still clung stubbornly to the paper. He felt like an intruder in someone else's life. This envelope had been tucked away, hidden from the world for decades, maybe longer. His hands, usually steady from years of working with tools, were noticeably trembling. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "It's probably just a dry cleaning receipt," he whispered to the empty room. Or a note from a frustrated artist to a landlord, but he didn't believe that. You don't seal a dry cleaning receipt with wax and hide it behind a heavy wooden frame, using the tip of a small paring knife. He gently pried the rest of the wax away. It flaked off like dried blood. He slid his finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't modern paper. It was thick, textured, and had yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried, written in an ink that had faded from black to a ghostly brown. It was in English, which surprised him, but the phrasing felt old-fashioned. "To whoever finds this behind the storm," the note began, "I cannot keep the truth on the surface any longer. The sea is a mask. The face beneath is the prize. If this has traveled far, please, let the light find it again. It was never meant to be a secret, only a sanctuary." Arthur read the words 3 times. His skin felt cold. "The face beneath is the prize," he muttered. He looked back at the painting. The dark, muddy waves of the stormy coastline looked back at him, dull and unremarkable. But the note suggested that the storm was just a cover. He remembered stories he had read in the papers about overpainting. During wars or times of great upheaval, people would often paint a boring, worthless scene over a masterpiece to smuggle it past soldiers or thieves. Was it possible that his $5 investment was a sanctuary for something else? He stood up and walked to his supply closet. Arthur wasn't a professional art restorer, but he was a hobbyist who enjoyed bringing old furniture back to life. He knew the basics of solvents and surfaces. He grabbed a bottle of high-grade mineral spirits, some cotton swabs, and a powerful desk lamp. He set the lamp up so it shone directly onto the corner of the painting. Under the harsh, bright light, the stormy painting looked even worse. The brush strokes were thick and clumsy. He chose a small spot in the upper right-hand corner, where the sky was a flat, lifeless gray. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard, he thought it might bruise. "Just a small test," he told himself. "If I ruin a $5 painting, it's no big loss." He pressed the damp swab against the canvas and began to move it in a tiny, circular motion. At first, nothing happened. The gray paint was stubborn and dry. But as the solvent began to break down the top layer, a dark, oily residue began to come away on the cotton. He replaced the swab with a fresh one and continued. Slowly, a patch of the gray sky began to dissolve. Arthur held his breath. He didn't even realize he was holding it until his lungs began to ache beneath the muddy gray paint. A sliver of color appeared, It wasn't gray. It wasn't blue. It was a deep, rich, glowing gold color, so vibrant it looked like it was being lit from within the canvas itself. Arthur gasped and pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He sat back in his chair, his eyes wide. That single streak of gold didn't belong in a storm. It looked like the embroidery of a fine silk sleeve or the edge of a gilded chair. He looked at the note again. The face beneath is the prize. He worked for the next 3 hours, losing all track of time. He didn't strip the whole painting. He knew that would be dangerous. Instead, he cleaned 3 small windows in different areas of the canvas. In the center, where the tallest wave had been, he found a patch of skin tone pale, luminous ivory that had the unmistakable texture of a human forehead. In the bottom corner, where he thought there were rocks, he found the intricate lace of a collar. This wasn't just a good painting underneath. The quality of the work he was seeing in these tiny windows was unlike anything he had ever seen in person. It had a depth and a soul to it. Whoever had painted the person underneath this sea was a master of light. By 3 a.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the world outside silent and dripping. Arthur sat in his kitchen, surrounded by used cotton swabs and the smell of chemicals. He looked at the painting, which now looked like a strange patchwork quilt of muddy waves and brilliant, hidden glimpses of a person. He felt a sudden wave of paranoia. He got up and checked the lock on his front door. Then he closed the heavy curtains over his windows. He felt like he was guarding $1 billion secret in a $20 apartment. Who was the person in the portrait? Why was it hidden? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do now? He knew he couldn't go back to Elias at the shop. Elias was a good man, but he was a gossip. If word got out that Arthur had found something valuable, his quiet life would be over. But he also knew he couldn't keep this in his kitchen forever. The chemicals he was using were basic. If he wasn't careful, he could destroy the very treasure he had just found. He realized he needed an expert. But not just any expert. He needed someone he could trust. Someone who wouldn't try to steal it from him. He thought of an old friend from his school days. A woman named Beverly, who had gone on to work in the archives of the city's largest museum. They hadn't spoken in years. But she had always been honest to a fault. Arthur wrapped the painting back in its plastic bag and wrapped that in a thick wool blanket. He tucked the note into his wallet, keeping it close to his body. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair, facing the door, watching the sun slowly begin to bleed through the cracks in the curtains. He had started the day as a man looking for a way to pass the time. He was ending it as the keeper of a mystery that felt far too big for his small hands as the city began to wake up. Arthur felt a strange sense of mourning. He knew that once he showed this to someone else, the secret wouldn't be his anymore. The storm had protected the prize for 100 years. Now he was about to blow the storm away. The bus ride to the city felt longer than it ever had before. Arthur sat with the blanket-trapped package resting on his knees, his arms looped tightly around it. Every time the bus hit a pothole or the brakes screeched, he flinched. To the other passengers, he just looked like an old man carrying a piece of scrap wood. Art History Wing, just as the morning fog was lifting. The building was made of heavy stone and smelled like old books and expensive floor wax. It was a world Arthur usually felt he didn't belong in. He found the office he was looking for at the end of a long, quiet hallway. The door read, Beverly Vance, Head of Conservation and Archival Research. He knocked. A moment later, the door swung open. Beverly looked older, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of thick glasses. But she still had the same kind expression he remembered from 30 years ago. Arthur, she asked, her voice full of genuine surprise. I haven't seen you since the reunion in the 90s. What on earth are you doing here at 9 in the morning? I found something, Bev, Arthur said, his voice a bit raspy. I didn't know who else to go to. I think I found something important. Beverly smiled, the way a professional smiles at an amateur who probably found a nice reproduction. Most people do, Arthur. Usually it's a very nice print or a copy of a famous work. Come in, have some tea, and let's manage our expectations. Arthur didn't sit down. He walked straight to her large, felt-covered examination table and carefully unwrapped the blanket. He laid the canvas down. Beverly leaned in, squinting. The frame is lovely, 18th century Dutch style, though heavily damaged. But the painting, Arthur... It's quite grim, isn't it? A bit of a mess, really. Look closer, Arthur urged. Look at the windows. He pointed to the 3 small spots he had cleaned the night before. Beverly pulled a magnifying lamp over the table. She clicked on the high-intensity light. For a full minute, the room was silent, except for the hum of the light bulb. Arthur watched her face. He saw the moment her professional politeness died. Her eyes widened and she let out a soft, sharp intake of breath. She moved the magnifying glass closer, her nose almost touching the canvas. Arthur, she whispered, her voice trembling. A shop? The dustbin. $5, he said. Beverly didn't laugh. She didn't even look up. She grabbed a pair of latex gloves and a small high-tech flashlight from her desk. She began to shine the light at an angle across the surface of the painting. The way this paint is layered... It's not just a hobbyist's work, she murmured, almost to herself. Look at the pigments. That gold. That's genuine lapis lazuli mixed into the blue undertones. Nobody has used that since the 1600s. And the crackler. The way the paint has cracked over time is consistent with centuries of age, not a modern fake. She looked at Arthur. And for the first time, she looked genuinely frightened. Arthur, if what I think is under this storm is real, you aren't just carrying a painting. You're carrying a ghost. There were rumors of a portrait commissioned by a merchant in Amsterdam, a portrait of his daughter that disappeared. During a raid in the late 1800s, it was documented in one ledger, and then never seen again. Is it her? Arthur asked, his heart hammering. I can't say for sure, Beverly said, regaining her professional composure, but unable to hide the shaking of her hands. But the technique, the way the light catches the skin in that tiny patch you cleaned... It's identical to the Golden Age masters. There are maybe 3 people in history who could paint light like that. She sat down heavily in her chair. If word gets out that this is in a private apartment, collectors will be at your door by sunset. Not all of them are nice people. This isn't a $5 hobby anymore, Arthur. This is a target on your back. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had wanted the painting to be special, but he hadn't realized that special meant dangerous. What do we do? He asked. We need a full X-ray, Beverly said, standing up with a new sense of urgency. We need to see what's under the storm without removing any more paint. If it is the lost daughter portrait, every inch of that top layer of gray paint has to be removed by a professional with a microscope. One wrong move and the masterpiece is gone forever. She looked at him seriously. I can get you into the lab under my name. We'll call it Project X. No names, no records, until we know for sure. But Arthur, you need to understand, once we turn that X-ray machine on, there's no going back. If it's what I think it is, your life as you know it is over. Arthur looked at the small, ugly painting of the sea. He thought about his quiet apartment, his tea, and his simple walks. Then he thought about the gold sleeve and the ivory forehead hiding under the mud. He thought about the note in his wallet. Let the light find it again. White room filled with machines that looked like they belonged in a hospital. She carefully placed the painting on a glass tray and slid it into a large metal sleeve. Arthur stood behind a light-lined glass partition. He watched as Beverly tapped at a computer screen. Processing, she said. A black and white image began to flicker onto the monitor. At first, it was just a blur of gray. But then, as the computer adjusted the contrast to look through the top layer of lead-based paint, a shape began to form. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a coastline. A face appeared on the screen. A young woman, her eyes incredibly clear, even in an X-ray, looking directly at the camera. She was wearing a high ruffled collar and a headpiece adorned with pearls. She looked so alive, so real, that Arthur instinctively reached out to touch the monitor. My God, Beverly whispered. tears actually springing to her eyes. It's not just a study. It's the finished piece. Suddenly, the heavy door to the lab creaked open. A man in a sharp, expensive suit stood there, flanked by 2 security guards. He wasn't smiling, Professor Vance, the man said, his voice cold and commanding. I assume this has something to do with the discovery rumors already hitting the local news. Arthur froze. The secret was out. And the man in the suit didn't look like he was there to help. The man in the suit stepped into the sterile white light of the lab. His name was Julian, the museum's director of acquisitions. He was a man who saw art not as beauty, but as a series of zeros on a bank statement. He didn't look at the painting with wonder. He looked at it with hunger. Behind him, the security guards stood like statues, their presence making the small room feel incredibly cramped. This is a private matter, Julian Beverly said, her voice steady despite the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. Arthur is an old friend. He brought in a family heirloom for a preliminary scan. There's no need for the cavalry. Julian walked over to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he saw the X-ray of the woman with the pearl headpiece. He let out a slow whistle. A family heirloom. Don't insult my intelligence, Beverly. I've spent 20 years looking for brushwork like that. That's not a family heirloom. That's a miracle found in a gutter. He turned his gaze to Arthur, who felt like a rabbit cornered by a fox. And you. I heard rumors at the cafe near the thrift shop. People talk, you know. They say you bought it for the price of a sandwich. Arthur didn't back down. He stepped forward, placing his hand near the canvas, though he didn't touch it. It doesn't matter what I paid for it. It's mine. And I'd like to take it home now. Julian laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Take it home? To an apartment with 1 lock and no climate control. This painting is over 300 years old, sir. If the humidity in your kitchen changes by 10%, the paint will flake off like old skin. You'd be destroying history. If you walk out that door with this, and anything happens to it, the art world will never forgive you. The pressure was suffocating. Arthur looked at Beverly, seeking help. She looked torn. She knew Julian was a shark, but she also knew he was right about the preservation. The painting was fragile. Now that the storm was being peeled back, the ancient paint underneath was exposed to the modern world for the first time in centuries. I can offer you a temporary loan agreement, Julian said, his tone shifting to something more persuasive. We put it in our high-security vault. We bring in the best restorers in the world. We verify the artist. You keep the title, but we keep it safe. And when it's time to sell land, we both know you will sell the museum takes a small commission for the work. Arthur looked at the X-ray on the screen. The woman in the portrait looked so peaceful, so unaware of the men arguing over her worth. He realized that if he gave it to Julian, it would just be moving from one dark place to another, from a dusty shop to a cold steel vault. No, Arthur said firmly. I'm not signing anything today. Beverly, can we wrap it back up? Julian's face darkened. For a second, it looked like he might order the guards to intervene. But he knew the optics of stealing a painting from an old man in front of a senior staff member would be a disaster. Fine, he snapped. Go, take it. But don't be surprised when the phone starts ringing. Collectors have ears everywhere. By tonight, people much less polite than I am will know your address. Beverly helped Arthur wrap the painting back in the acid-free paper in the wool blanket. Her face was pale. He's right about one thing, Arthur. You aren't safe. You need to go somewhere else. Don't go back to your apartment tonight. Arthur thanked her and hurried out of the building. He didn't take the bus this time. He took a taxi, glancing out the back window every few seconds to see if a black car was following him. His mind was spinning. $1 million? $5 million. The numbers felt fake. What felt real was the weight of the canvas against his side. He checked into a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of the city, paying in cash. He sat on the edge of the bed, the painting resting on the pillow next to him. He pulled out the note he had found in the frame. The face beneath is the prize. He spent the night researching the lost daughter on his phone. He found an old digital archive of a Dutch merchant's diary. The merchant had written about his daughter Clara, who had died of a fever at age 19. He had commissioned the greatest artist of the age to paint her not as a symbol of wealth, but so he wouldn't forget her face. When the city was under siege years later, he had supposedly hired a local painter to cover her image with a boring sea, so the invading soldiers wouldn't steal the portrait of his beloved girl. Arthur felt a tear prick his eye. It wasn't about the money. It was about a father trying to save the only thing he had left of his daughter. The storm wasn't just a cover. It was a shield of love. Suddenly, there was a heavy knock at the motel door. Arthur's heart stopped. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. He stood up, looking for a weapon, but all he had was his umbrella. He crept to the door and looked through the tiny peephole. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't a thief. It was Elias, the old shop owner from the dustbin. He looked exhausted, his coat soaked through with rain. Arthur cracked the door open, keeping the chain on. "Elias, how did you find me?" "You always mentioned this place when we talked about the best coffee in the county," Elias wheezed, leaning against the doorframe. "Arthur, listen to me. 2 men came to the shop an hour after you left yesterday. They weren't from a museum. They saw your name on a repair log from last year." Elias looked at Arthur with wide, frightened eyes. "They offered me $10,000 just for your address. I told them to get out, but they didn't look like they took no for an answer. You can't stay here. You can't go home. This thing you found? It's too big for one man to hold." Arthur realized then that the unbelievable part of his story wasn't just the discovery. It was the fact that a $5 piece of wood could turn the whole world upside down. He looked at Elias, then at the blanket on the bed. "I have a plan," Arthur said, his voice regaining its strength. "But I'm going to need your help to finish it. We aren't going to sell it to a collector, and we aren't going to let Julian hide it in a vault. What are you going to do?" Elias asked. Arthur smiled, a small, tired smile. "I'm going to do what the father wanted. I'm going to let the light find it again, but I'm going to do it on my terms." The morning of the auction wasn't held in a dark room with men in suits. Arthur had refused that. Instead, he made a deal that shocked the art world. He agreed to let a major international auction house handle the sale, but only if the final viewing happened in the most unlikely of places, the back room of the dustbin. Dusty Shop was lined with news vans and shiny black cars. People from all over the world had flown in to see the $5 masterpiece. Arthur stood inside, wearing the same old coat he had worn the day he found the painting. He felt calm. The fear he had felt at the motel had faded, replaced by a sense of duty. Elias was there too, wearing a boatie that looked like it hadn't been tied since the 1970s. He was beaming. His shop, which had been on the verge of closing due to rising debts, was now the center of the universe. "Are you ready, Arthur?" Beverly asked. She had stayed by his side throughout the entire process, acting as his shield against people like Julian. "I'm ready," Arthur said. He walked to the center of the room, where a small easel stood. The painting was no longer a muddy mess of gray waves. Under Beverly's expert care, she was breathtaking. The gold on her sleeve glowed like real metal, and her eyes had a spark of life that seemed to follow Arthur as he moved. She didn't look like a museum piece. She looked like a person who had been waiting a long time to be seen. The auction was a whirlwind. Bids came in from museums in London, private collectors in Tokyo, and billionaires in New York. The numbers climbed so fast that Arthur stopped trying to keep track. 10 million, 20 million, 30. When the gavel finally fell, the price was a staggering $52 million. The room erupted in applause. But Arthur felt a strange hollowness. He looked at the painting, realizing that in a few hours it would be crated up and flown across the ocean. He had done what the note asked. But he knew that the money wasn't the prize the note had mentioned. A few days later, after the taxes were settled and the lawyers had taken their shares, Arthur sat in his small kitchen. He was now a very wealthy man, but he didn't feel any different. He still liked his tea, and he still liked the sound of the rain. He picked up a pen and began to write some checks. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a fleet of cars. Instead, his first check went to Elias. It was enough to buy the building the dustbin sat in, ensuring the shop would never be torn down for a parking lot. But there was a condition: the back half of the shop had to be turned into a free art school for the local kids. His second check went to the university where Beverly worked. It was an endowment specifically for the restoration of forgotten works he wanted to make. Sure that other people like him, people who saw beauty in the grime, had the resources to bring that beauty back to life. As for Arthur himself, he stayed in his apartment. He liked the creaky floors and the way the light hit his kitchen table in the afternoon. He did make one change, though. He bought a high-quality replica of the portrait of Clara. He put it in the original $5 frame that had held the secret for so long. One afternoon, months later, Arthur was walking through the park. He saw a young man sitting on a bench, looking at a beat-up old guitar he had clearly just bought at a yard sale. The young man looked disappointed, pointing out a scratch on the wood to his friend. Arthur stopped and smiled. "Don't worry about the scratch, son," he said gently. The young man looked up, confused. "It's just a piece of junk, honestly. I think I got ripped off." Arthur patted the man on the shoulder. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes the things that look the most broken are just holding on to something special until the right person comes along. Trust your instincts. They're usually smarter than your eyes." As Arthur walked away, he felt a lightness in his chest. He had spent $5 and changed the world, not because of the money, but because he had bothered to look closer when everyone else had walked by. He went home, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. On the wall, the portrait of the girl in the gold dress seemed to smile. The storm was over, and finally, everyone was home. A full year had passed since the night the gavel fell, and the world learned about the girl under the waves. For the rest of the world, the story was a headline that had eventually been replaced by other news. But for the small town where Arthur lived, the story was just beginning its second chapter. Arthur woke up early, just as he always had. He didn't have a gold-plated alarm clock or a silk robe. He still lived in the same apartment, though he had He liked his life, found that having millions of dollars didn't actually make his tea taste better. But it did make him sleep more soundly, knowing that he would never have to worry about a medical bill or a late rent check again. After his breakfast, he walked down to the old neighborhood. The changes were subtle but beautiful. What used to be a row of boarded-up windows was now becoming a vibrant part of the city. He stopped in front of a building that looked brand new, but still had the original brickwork. A sign above the door read, "The Sanctuary Art Center." Beneath the name, in smaller letters, it said, "Founded by Elias and Arthur." When Arthur walked inside, he wasn't greeted by cold marble or silent security guards. He was greeted by the sound of children laughing and the smell of wet clay. In the back, where the junk used to be piled to the ceiling, there was now a bright, open studio. Elias was there, looking younger than he had in decades. He wasn't squinting at broken watches anymore. He was helping a young boy named Leo straighten a canvas on an easel. Elias looked up and waved Arthur over. "He found this in the alley, Arthur," Elias said, gesturing to a piece of discarded plywood the boy was painting on. "He thinks he can turn it into a sunset." Arthur knelt down next to the boy. "The best things are usually found in the places nobody else thinks to look," Arthur told him with a wink. The boy smiled and went back to his work. Was empty now, preserved behind glass as a piece of history. Beside it was a plaque that didn't talk about the money or the Dutch master. It simply told the story of the merchant who wanted to save his daughter's memory. "People come from 3 towns over just to see the frame," Elias whispered. They don't care that the real painting is in a museum in Europe. They care that it was here. It gives them hope that they might find something of their own. Later that afternoon, Arthur received a letter. It was from Beverly. She had moved to Amsterdam to oversee the final preservation of the lost daughter portrait. She sent a photograph of the painting in its new home. It was the centerpiece of a room dedicated to the hidden masters. In her letter, she wrote, "Arthur, the experts are still arguing about the brushstrokes, but the public doesn't care about the technical stuff.
Oh.
They stand in front of her for hours. They call her the girl of the storm because of you. A story that was meant to be buried forever is now being told every single day. You didn't just find a painting, you rescued a soul." Arthur put the letter in a drawer right next to the original note he had found behind the canvas. He realized that the unbelievable part of his story wasn't the $52 million. It was the fact that he could walk down the street and see a kid painting on a piece of trash. Believing it could be art, he had used his luck to buy a future for a town that had almost given up. As the sun began to set, Arthur walked back to his apartment. He passed the old thrift shop location, which was now part of the center. He thought about the rainy Tuesday when he had almost stayed home. He thought about the magnetic pull of that muddy gray painting. He sat in his favorite chair and looked at the replica on his wall. He realized that everyone is carrying a storm around with them, a layer of grit or hardship or gray days that hide who they really are. Sometimes all it takes is one person to look past the surface and see the gold underneath. Arthur closed his eyes and listened to the city outside. He was just an ordinary man who had trusted his gut, and in doing so, he had proven that miracles don't always happen in cathedrals or palaces. Sometimes they're just waiting in a dusty corner, tucked behind a $5 frame, waiting for someone to stop and say, "Tell me your story." The lights in the apartment dimmed as evening took hold, but the glow from the portrait on the wall seemed to linger just a little longer than the rest, a quiet reminder that the light once found never truly goes out again. The fame didn't come all at once. It arrived like a rising tide. First it was the local newspapers, then the national talk shows, and finally, the documentary filmmakers who parked their vans outside Arthur's modest apartment building. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted to see the man with the golden eye. They wanted to know the secret trick for spotting a masterpiece in a pile of trash. They wanted him to tell them that anyone could get rich if they just looked hard enough. But Arthur didn't want to be a celebrity. He said no to the book deals. He even said no to a reality show where he would go around to different cities, hunting for treasure. To Arthur, that felt like a betrayal of why he had bought the painting in the first place. He hadn't bought it to get rich. He had bought it because it looked lonely. One afternoon, a young journalist managed to catch him as he was sitting on a park bench, feeding the birds. She didn't have a camera crew, just a small notepad and a respectful expression. "Mr. Arthur," she said, sitting at the far end of the bench, "I'm not here to ask about the $50 million. I just want to know, do you ever regret it? You ever wish you had just left the painting in the shop and kept your quiet life?" Arthur looked at a pigeon pecking at a crust of bread. He thought about the phone calls from strangers asking for money. He thought about the way people stared at him when he walked down the street. Then he thought about the art center, and the kids who now had a place to go after school, and the look on Ilias's face when he realized he didn't have to sell his life's work to pay the rent. "No," Arthur said softly. "I don't regret it, but not for the reasons you might think. I don't care about the bank account. What I care about is that I proved the world wrong. Everyone saw an ugly, dark sea. I saw a girl who needed a friend. The world needs more people who look past the ugly to find the friend underneath." The journalist wrote that down, nodded, and left him in peace. It was the only interview he ever gave. A few weeks later, Arthur decided to do something he had been putting off. He took a plane his first time in first class, which he found a bit too fancy for his taste, flew to the city, where the lost daughter was now on permanent display. He didn't call ahead. He didn't ask for a private tour. He simply bought a ticket like everyone else and stood in line. He wore a hat and kept his head down, blending in with the crowd of tourists and students. When he finally reached the room where she hung, he stopped breathing for a second. The museum had given her a wall all to herself. The lighting was perfect. making the gold on her sleeve look like it was glowing with its own heat. There were dozens of people standing in front of it, whispering in different languages. He stood at the very back of the crowd. He watched a young girl, no older than 7, pull on her mother's hand. "Mommy, look at her eyes," the girl whispered. "She looks like she's about to tell a secret." Arthur smiled to himself. That was it. That was the whole point. As he turned to leave, he noticed an old man sitting on a bench in the gallery. The man was staring at the painting with tears in his eyes. Arthur sat down next to him. They didn't speak for a long time. They just sat there, two strangers connected by a piece of canvas that had almost been lost to time. "It makes you feel like you're not alone, doesn't it?" the old man said eventually, his voice thick with emotion. "It does," Arthur replied. "It really does." Arthur returned home the next day. He felt a sense of closure. He had seen her one last time, and he knew she was safe. She didn't belong to him anymore. She belonged to everyone. He spent the rest of his years living simply. He spent his mornings at the art center, helping Elias organize the supplies. He spent his afternoons walking through the neighborhood, keeping his eyes open. He still visited the local thrift shops, but he never bought another painting. He didn't need to. He had already found the one he was meant to find when Arthur finally passed away. Many years later, he left his remaining fortune to a trust that ensured the art center would stay free forever. He didn't want a statue. He didn't want a street named after him. But if you go to that small town today, and you walk into the Sanctuary Art Center, you'll see something interesting. In the very back of the studio, there is a small wooden crate. It's filled with old, dusty frames and canvases that look like junk to the untrained eye. Above the crate, there is a small sign in simple black letters. It doesn't have a name on it. It just says, "Look closer." You might find a friend, and every day a new child reaches into that crate, picks up a dusty old board, and starts to paint something beautiful. Arthur's story didn't end with a sale. It ended with a beginning. It ended with the idea that as long as there is someone willing to trust their instincts and look beneath the surface, the world will never truly be out of miracles. The rain started to fall again as the last. The students left the building for the day. A soft, rhythmic patter against the windows. Inside, the lights stayed on for just a moment longer, reflecting off the empty gold frame on the wall, shining bright in the quiet dark.